This video is for answers for your interim interest homework. Again, remembering that I'm going to do all of these in succession. If you'd like to pause your video in between each to allow yourself to try it before you see my answer, that would be recommended as well. Okay, so let me remind you, interim interest is the part at the end of the month that the buyer is paying on his new loan because interest is paid in arrears on the month that he closes. The lender wants to collect the last few days of the month. The lender wants to be paid for every day that the buyer, the borrower, has the money. So remember your formula here. Annual interest over principal times rate. And of course, you're remembering that the AI stands for annual or annualized interest technically. And then principal is your loan balance and rate is going to be the interest rate. So by taking this, I have the principal and I have the interest rate. $124,000 times 6% interest. And while that's an interesting number, all that's actually going to tell me is what my monthly interest is. I'm sorry, that's going to tell me what my annual interest is. $7,440. The only reason I need this number is because I'm going to divide it by 360 to find out how much my daily interest is. Dividing that number by 360, because there are 360 days in a year in our class, I find that the interim interest is $20.67 per day. Might be a rounding issue there. This is the number that I'm using. Okay, now I know how much it is per day, so I need to figure out how many days the buyer is going to be responsible for. Well, let me remind you, in interim interest, 30, because there's 30 days in a month, minus the day of closing, in this case, the 28th, plus 1, because we add in the day of closing. This is one of the few times when the buyer is responsible for the closing date. So 30 minus 28 is 2 plus 1 is 3 days. And now we can figure out this problem. 3 days times 2067 per day equals, that's 3. I have it came out to $62. Hopefully yours will be very, very close to that as well. $62 debit buyer. Why debit buyer? Because this is dealing with the buyer's new loan and the seller has nothing to do with the new loan. So this has nothing to do with the seller. Okay, interim interest. Scenario 2, loan amount $320,000. At this point, I'm not going to do the T-bar every time. I'm just going to jump right into the problem. 320,000 principal times rate of 4.5% equals $14,400, which is interesting number, but again, only important because I need to find the daily rate. So I'm going to divide that by 360. And that's going to be $40 per day. So the interest is accruing at $40 per day. We're closing on September 12th, remembering, of course, that interim interest is a calendar month proration. So 30 days in September minus 12, the closing date, 30 days minus the closing date, minus 12. And then when it comes to interim interest, we add the day of closing because the buyer is responsible for that as well. So 30 minus 12 is 18 plus 1 is 19 days. And finally, we have 19 days times $40 per day. This is not an insignificant amount of money. This is going to be 760 bucks, it looks like. Yeah, $760. And you go, wow, why such a big difference between this one and the first one? Well, notice in the first one that it closed on January 28th, and this one is closing much earlier in the month. Now, granted, it was also a larger loan amount as well. But having said that, this is one of the reasons that people used to always try to close earlier in the month. It reduces the amount of interim interest that you have to pay, which reduces the amount of money that you have to come to closing with on the buyer side. Okay. All right, let's take a look at another one here. And again, same story that we told a little bit earlier. If all of these look familiar, this is by design, because what we're trying to do is get that muscle memory so that whenever you see these come up, it does not scare you. You just simply plug it in and start calculating. $220,000 is the principal, times 7% is the interest rate. All right, so 220 times 7%. Is 15,400. There's your annualized interest, but let's divide it by 360. And what you will find is that the interest is $42.78 per day, roughly. $42.78 per day. Now, notice what we did to you here. We're trying to trick you. Okay, we say that the closing date is on April 30th. We're trying to get you to say, well, there is no interim interest. But that's not true. Because remember what the interim interest formula is. 30, because there are 30 days in the month. In this case, it's closing on the 30th. So 30 minus 30 is, in fact, 0. But remember, the buyer's responsible for the day of closing. So there's always going to be at least one day of interim interest. Okay. So obviously, the math is pretty easy on this. $42.78 per day times 1 day. Buyer debit of $42.78. And again, you keep hearing me say debit to the buyer. Remember, interim interest only applies to the buyer because it's the buyer's new loan. A couple more practice problems here on interim interest. And again, hopefully by now it's starting to look familiar to you. So what's going on in this first one here? Let me see if I can get it in the picture. There we go. The loan amount of 180, another word for loan amount is principal. The interest formula says times rate, 5.75%. Okay, that number is going to equal, let me make sure I punch it into my calculator correctly, which by the way, keep in mind on the test, it is important that you punch the numbers in correctly to the calculator. Otherwise, you might make a simple mistake. The good thing about punching the numbers in the calculator wrong, though, is we can't anticipate that mistake. So oftentimes, none of the answers would be reflective of your answer. So you would probably pick up that mistake. All right, let's divide that by 360 to figure out how much the taxes are per day. And in this case, the taxes per day come out to be $28.75, $28.75. Okay. This is an interim interest problem, so we're starting to know a few things by this point. One is that for calculating the number of days of interim interest, you take the days in the month, you subtract out the closing date, you add back in the closing date, and 30 minus 25 is 5, plus 1 is 6 days. Okay. And then you have 28.75 times $6 per day equals $172.50. And 250. And by now, hopefully you're getting familiar with the fact that interim interest is always a debit to the buyer. If you're not exhausted with these, let's do one more. And keep in mind, you can always come back to these and just do them over and over again to make sure you're getting the correct answer. And this final question here, no tricks. And typically speaking, this is not where we choose to do a whole lot of tricks. 417,000 principal times rate of 4 1/4. is 17,722.5. Okay, 722.50. One of the things I stumbled on there is I was making sure I punched the number in my calculator right. I hate it when I have like a 4.25 because oftentimes I just accidentally skip the 2 and I end up making it 4.5. And again, that's that mistake that could cause you to miss the problem. So just be careful on that. Let's figure out how much our daily rate's going to be. $49, and I'm going to round to 23. $49.23 per day. And then we're closing on June 22nd. Doesn't really matter what month it is because it's a calendar month proration, so they're all the same. 30 minus 22, 30 days in a month minus 22, the date of closing, and then add back in the date of closing. So we have 30 minus 22 is 8 plus 1 is 9. 9 days times 49.23 per day. Mr. Buyer, please bring $443.06 to cover the interim interest. And technically speaking, the buyer is not bringing specifically for that. They're just bringing a bunch of debits and credits to the table. Think of a debit as something that the buyer has to pay at closing. Think of a credit to the buyer as something that he's getting credit for. And then same thing for the seller. Think in terms of the seller. A debit to the seller is something they have to pay. And then a credit to the seller would be something that they're getting credit for. Interim interest, as we've mentioned earlier, is simply a debit to the buyer, has nothing to do with the seller.